Okay, we'll get started here. I just want to say welcome back, or if it's your first time here, welcome to Foundations. Just so that we have an idea, how many are here for the first time? Haven't been here before? Okay, a few. How many are returning? Okay, good. That's a good number. So we're going to go through Daniel this semester, and I'll give kind of a brief overview to start the semester. Again, I want to just kind of gauge you guys to see where we're at. How many are familiar with the book of Daniel, have read Daniel, and could say a few things about what's in Daniel? Okay, some of you, right? It's been a while. There's a lot in Daniel. Actually, if you use the Bible to understand the Bible, you can see God's plan throughout Daniel. So we're going to cover what we can this semester. We won't cover all of it, but we'll cover some of the meat that's there in the book of Daniel. Somebody explained it to me this way one time. Well, let me do this first. I'll introduce myself so you guys know who I am. I'm Lamar, or Star's husband. A lot of people just refer to me as Star's husband. She works at CSU, so she has the answers for everything that you need to know about CSU. You can ask her those questions. So we get back to Daniel. It's an Old Testament book. Maybe some of us are familiar with the story about the lion's den, or the story about his three friends who were cast into a furnace. But what we're going to see is that actually Daniel is very relevant to us today. The Lord in his wisdom has put things in the scripture for us that are very relevant for us in our Christian life today. And I'll go back to what somebody shared with me, because Daniel can be distracting. There's a lot happening there. There's a lot of things going on. And somebody, I apologize for this example if you're a vegetarian, but they explained it to me like a chicken. Okay, they said, a chicken has feathers. It has a crown. It has a crop. It has a beak. They got funny feet. They look like dinosaurs. But when you consider eating a chicken, none of that is really relevant to what's going to feed and supply you. What you consider is the meat and the egg, right? There's certain things about a chicken that are there that it needs to be sustained as life. So it needs feathers, right? It needs, its feet and stuff like that. But don't be distracted by those things. What we want to do is we want to pull the meat and the things that are going to feed us and give us life out of Daniel. Jeremiah 15:16 says, "Your words were found, and I ate them." So then the words can become the gladness and joy of our heart. So what we want to do is we want to pull out the things of Daniel that are going to feed us. Consider that as we go through Daniel this semester. So it's important to set the background. I don't have a lot of slides for you guys. There's two focused on verses here that have two asterisks next to them, and that would be 2 Timothy 2:22 and Daniel 1:8. And those have asterisks because if you don't take away a lot, you can't remember a lot. You want to go back to those verses and try and focus on some of the speaking about what was the content of those verses. So the background to Daniel is this, that the children of Israel, who were God's testimony on earth, had become degraded. And in the beginning of Daniel, they're carried off in captivity to a place called Babylon. There's a king there. His name is Nebuchadnezzar. So you'll hear that and those references a lot this semester. again, this is relevant to us today, and it has a kind of a typology that we have to understand. Nebuchadnezzar represents God's enemy. Babylon represents his kingdom. And in the very beginning of Daniel, it's mentioned that there are vessels taken out of the house of God, and those vessels are brought into Babylon, and they're brought actually into the treasury of Nebuchadnezzar, which is associated with idols. So there's some underlying principles here. And number one is that, of course, maybe we're all familiar with being called vessels. We're vessels of God. A lot of people are familiar with that kind of typology. But here in this picture, what's happened is these vessels are being brought into an area that's just completely saturated with idols and idol worship. And we have to see that what's happening in Daniel is actually there's a warfare of God's kingdom versus Satan's kingdom. And in the middle of this warfare are vessels. And so we want to consider it this way when the word defilement is brought up, and I was considering how that would relate to a vessel. And if I gave you a cup of water and it was a clean cup and you could see through it, it was glass and it looked very inviting, you wouldn't have a problem drinking out of that vessel, right? But if I gave you a cup of water and the water was filthy, the water was muddy, it was dirty, you could say that the water was defiled. It's what's within a vessel that makes it valuable. And what's happening is Satan is coming to these vessels of God and trying to defile their content and their constitution. So that's the background to this book. But we have a treasure in our earthen vessel, and so we can see that actually there are a number of things according to the principles and the typology here that Satan attacks in particular ways. He attacks these vessels by, in the beginning, we can see he changes Daniel and his friends' names, that is their identity. He changes their language that they're speaking, and then he attempts to change their diet as well. Of course, they take a stand against this change, and I'll just give you, to open this and give you the background, it's dark, but we have to understand that this is the enemy's attack against the vessels of God. The names, Daniel, when he was carried off, Nebuchadnezzar came in and changed his name to Belteshazzar. And so his name, Daniel, means God is my judge. Belteshazzar means the favorite of Bel, which is an idol. Hananiah was one of his companions, one of Daniel's companions. And Hananiah's name means Yah, or it's short for Jehovah, which was the Lord's name in the Old Testament. Yah has graciously given. And his name was changed to Shadrach, which means enlightened by the sun god. And Mishael was another companion, and his name means who is what God is. And his name was changed to Meshach, again by the Babylonians. And that Meshach means who can be like the goddess Shak. Azariah was the third companion, and his name was changed to Abednego, which means a faithful servant of the fire god Nego. So you can see here the first thing that's happening is this change in names, and the original names all indicate that these vessels belong to God. And the enemy's attack is to try and change these vessels to at least in this sense, to have the appearance of belonging to idols or being associated with idols. So I have some verses on your sheet here, and I'll just hit a few of them, but it's kind of, I'll hit them when they're in context. This kingdom versus kingdom battle that I mentioned, Nebuchadnezzar didn't know. He didn't know that God's kingdom, God's kingdom actually would end up defeating the Babylonian kingdom, or in typology, Satan's kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar, in representing Satan, actually had to pass through a process until it says in Daniel 4:26 that you have come to know that the heavens do rule. So Nebuchadnezzar had to go through this process to see, because he thought that this kingdom of his was going to last, and that it was something that he had built up himself. But in Revelation, there's the term, fallen is Babylon the Great. So we see the end of Babylon there in Revelation is actually the loss of that kingdom and the destruction of that kingdom. And I've got a verse here that talks about the kingdom of, let me just read this one to you. Daniel 2:44, in the days of those kings, the God of the heavens will raise up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and its reign will not be left to another people, and it will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, and it will stand forever. So the result is already known. The result is already declared in the scripture. So for us today, we need to understand that this kingdom versus kingdom battle is going on. This attempt by the enemy to contaminate us as vessels of God is actually a real warfare that's taking place. And we'll see here in a minute, the strength here in Daniel was that he had companions. So again, the enemy is trying to change the language, trying to change the name or the identity, and then trying to change the diet or the constitution. This is a full-scale attack against the vessels of God. Yet, in Daniel 1:8, I don't have, Colin, can you go to that? I think it's the third slide. Oh, that's the wrong way. Yep, there it is. So if we can all read that together, let's do that. Ready? Go.
But Daniel set his heart not to defile himself with King's choice provision and with the wine that the king drank. So he requested of the leader of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself.
Okay, so Daniel takes a stand here, and what's happening is the Lord has given him a sense of wisdom. This is a young man, and he realizes that the king's choice provisions that they're being offered are provisions that are associated with being sacrificed to idols. And so Daniel recognizes this, the meat and the wine, and he takes a stand not to partake, because he realizes that this is a defiling thing when that food has been associated with idol worship and idol sacrifice. And I was considering this because this is that's why I've got it underlined and highlighted. Daniel set his heart not to defile himself. Daniel made this choice, and he was a young man, and at the time, God's testimony on the earth had been degraded to a very small number. They had been carried off into Babylon, and Daniel chose to set his heart. In Deuteronomy 30:19, it says, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life. The next verse says, for he is your life. So actually, Daniel made a choice. And for us, God has chosen us. God has called us. And he's waiting for us also to set our heart and to choose him. But I was really impressed when I was considering this. What caused him to make this decision? What drove him to set his heart? He knew, obviously, of the idol sacrifices there with the food. But I was impressed with, and I think it's on your sheet, Daniel 11:32. 11:32b, it's the second half of that verse, and it's right after Deuteronomy 30:19 that I mentioned. Why don't we go ahead and read that all together? Ready? Go.
But the people who know their God will show strength and take action.
Okay, Daniel knew his God. And because he knew his God, that caused him to set his heart not to be defiled. So we want to be those that know our God, and we want to be those who actually the Lord has called us, and he has called us out, and he has chosen us, and we want to choose him and choose life. This is a decision that set up God's testimony on the earth because he knew his God and he set his heart not to be defiled. This was the enemy's attack, and he was standing directly against the enemy in this scenario. And I was just appreciating that the condition of our heart directly impacts God's ability to carry out his plan on the earth. If you think that your heart and your decisions are small and they don't matter, if you look at Daniel, God was looking at this situation, and he had revealed himself to some extent to Daniel. And because he knew his God, he showed strength, he took action. But what he took action to do really stood out to me. He didn't take action to stand up and rise up against all the Babylonians and become a great warrior by himself. He chose to set his heart because he knew that the battle for the vessel was inwardly. He knew that there was a problem inwardly, and the enemy's attack was about the constitution of those that were being carried off. So his choice, because he knew his God, was that his inward parts would be taken care of to be set for the Lord. This is a choice, and we need to choose to set our heart. Sometimes we may have difficulty understanding the situation and setting our heart, or we may think that we've set our heart and we're not quite sure. And so this need comes up. Daniel's not alone. Daniel hasn't set his heart by himself. He has companions. And I think we're all familiar with the idea of sheep. We're being likened to sheep in the Bible. Sheep, their strength is in numbers. Their strength is in being drawn into a flock. And the predators that come in after them, and Danny probably knows better than I do, but they don't go after the entire flock all at once. Is that correct, right? They go after the sheep that is by itself, right, that has wandered off. But the Lord also goes after that sheep. So there's a warfare in that way as well. But we need to be gathered into the fold. Our safety, our protection in our Christian life is to be in the flock. And this concept is something that the Lord even brings out all the way in the beginning in Genesis. There's a verse that says in Genesis 2:18, it's not good for man to be alone. So all the way in the beginning of the Bible, the idea that man needs what he calls Eve as a helpmate. Man needs a helpmate. Man needs a companion. So there's this brought out in Genesis, and then all through the New Testament, there are a number of verses. Some are on your sheet where there's an Old Testament reference and a New Testament reference, and that's just to show you, as we consider Daniel, we should use the Bible to translate the Bible. Because if you take the context of what's in Daniel outside of the Bible, you'll get lost in the feathers and the funny-looking feet and stuff like that, and you'll miss the meat and the egg, right? You'll miss what supplies you with life, and you'll miss the line of life and line of light. So we'll get into, let me just give you this other example. I was kind of considering when we're built together, if I were to throw a stone on the ground, we're likened to living stones in the Bible. I could kick that stone around fairly easily, right? I could manipulate it, I could kick it around, I could separate it from different things. But as soon as that stone starts to get built together with other stones, it becomes a wall. I'm not going to kick a wall, break my foot, right? But it's the same thing in our Christian life, right? As we're built together with companions, we can actually, we're strengthened and we're encouraged by one another, but we can also become a wall. We can become a wall to the enemy. It keeps the attacks out, and it keeps all the life in, keeps the vessels from defilement. So we need to be, paired with those who are pursuing the Lord out of a pure heart, as it says in calling on the Lord out of a pure heart, as it says in 2 Timothy 2:22. Colin, if you could go to that slide. Let's all read this one together. Ready? Go.
But flee youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love,
Okay, so the concept here, if we can kind of pull some words out, have some key words, I think I have them at the top of your sheet there, is going to be set for set your heart. Flee, pursue, and call all come from this verse. Youthful lusts are going to be things that are not only outward, but they're also inward. And we need help to flee those things, right? Because we're in a battle, I think, just because of my background and understanding, I know that there's no such thing as an army of one. You can't stand against an enemy by yourself. It's a thought that's kind of a fallacy, and the enemy's oldest tactic is to divide and conquer. So what he'd like to do when you're being built up with companions or when you're pursuing the Lord is he'd like to come in and slowly separate and slowly break you off from where that protection is, from being built into the wall or from being in the midst of the flock. And these are being with other believers, being with those who are pursuing the Lord. It's very important because that's where our strength is in our Christian life. So I have a section here that says prayer with companions. And I want to present this to you. This was Daniel's experience. He had a life or death situation. Nebuchadnezzar was so crazy. He had a dream, forgot what it was. And then he brought a bunch of people. I'm paraphrasing this, but this is in the beginning of Daniel. You can read through it. And he said, bring all the wise men in. They brought all the wise men in. And he said, tell me what I dreamed last night. They said, nobody can do that. You're asking something that nobody's asked before. And he said, if you don't, I'm going to kill everybody. Okay, well, so they went back and they kind of came to him again. They said, look, this is not reasonable. And because nobody could interpret the dream, nobody could tell him what he dreamed that he didn't share with anybody, let alone interpret it, he set out to then have all the wise men murdered. Well, Daniel was included in that because of the way that he was selected as a young person. And so Daniel figured out that this was the situation. And he was facing death. And what he did with that information is in Daniel 2:17 through 18. Let's read that all together. Ready, go. Let's keep going and read 1 Thessalonians 3:8. So what he did was he took this situation and he brought it to his companions to pray about. He brought it to his companions to pray about, and then in this verse, the next verse on your sheet there, Daniel 2:23, the content of Nebuchadnezzar's dream is revealed to him. And he makes it very clear, I've got it in bold there and underlined, that it says, you have made known to me what we requested of you. So he brought something, not just before the Lord, but he brought it to his companions to pray about. And the result was, Daniel was able to be in front of the king of this was like Babylon, it was like the modern world at that time. So going in front of the king where all the wise men had failed and revealing something that only God could reveal. And he gave a perfect explanation as to what the dream was, and then he gave a perfect interpretation. But this was kind of secondary. I think the Lord was looking down on this situation, knowing Daniel, and then he was very pleased that he took this and realized that he needs his companions. And he needs his companions to pray for him. He was desperate in this situation. But the principle that's here is that for us to go on in our Christian life, we need companions and we need to pray with our companions. And the Lord honors that when we pray with our companions. Prayer is one of the most powerful things you can do in your Christian life. And it actually allows the Lord to move his hand on the earth. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he's there in their midst. And he's able to, when we're one with the Lord and when we're praying together with our companions and we're as a group, we are one with the Lord, he is able to bind on earth things that have already been bound and loose on earth things that have already been loosed. But he's waiting for us to pray in that way when we're one with him and when we're one with our companions. So you have a number of verses there that kind of strengthen that point that we don't necessarily have time to go through all of them. That Matthew 18:20, I mentioned, for where there are 2 or 3 gathered into my name, there am I in their midst. And then, when you pair that together with this verse in Psalm 16:11b, it says, in your presence is fullness of joy. So he's in the midst, and in his presence is fullness of joy. If we want to be those that are full of joy, we need to be in the Lord's presence. And we can certainly spend some time in the Lord's presence personally, but I feel like there's, in this, you can go back to your own experience. It's so much richer to pray with one another, to spend time with one another, and to be in the Lord's presence together. There are, as I mentioned, some verses in Ecclesiastes that kind of strengthen that point. And I'll just mention this one. I mentioned that we're in a warfare. In Ephesians, it says, until we all arrive. So this isn't that one of us would come out, as a greater Christian than the others, or as having more knowledge and experience than the others. But it's an until we all arrive church life that we should have, meaning that we're dependent on our companions to go on in the Lord. And it says in Romans 12:5 that we are one body in Christ and individually members one of another. So I can't go on with only a portion of my body, right? The whole body has to go forward. And this principle is brought out in the Word. I was impressed also in kind of looking into this and studying Elisha, who was a prophet in 2 Kings. In chapter 6, he has this situation where there's a battle coming, and he steps out. He's got a servant also with him, and he sees the enemy. But Elisha has a particular view that's presented to him where he can see that the situation that's there, although it looks dismal if you were to just look at the opposing army, that there are more that are on Elisha's side than there are visible in the opposing army. So this was Elijah's particular view. And his servant came out, and all he saw was the opposing army. And so what Elisha did was he prayed that his servant's eyes would be opened and that he would see the actual situation. And the result of that prayer was that the servant's eyes were opened and he saw that there were many more for us than against us. So sometimes we have a particular blockage, or we're having trouble trying to get through, and we're trying to contact the Lord, or we're trying to exercise and go on with the Lord, and we feel like we've hit a wall or we're stuck. I'll tell you, being with a companion, praying with a companion, being built up with other believers, it will push you beyond all those obstacles. It will open your eyes and help you see to go on with the Lord. And prayer, as I mentioned, together, one of the most powerful things you can do in your Christian life, because it grants you the ability to please the Lord and become a testimony for the Lord. One of the things that I wanted to point out here, and this is towards the end, I think it's on the back of your sheet, is that these companions, not only did they pray together, but they did something very particular. They called on the name of the Lord. And that's why I have 2 Timothy 2:22 here. And I've got some verses because I wanted to show you that this is something that started in the Old Testament, in Genesis. And maybe you're not familiar with it, never really heard of calling on the name of the Lord. I'll tell you this much. The section that you have on the back of your sheet is it's a very small section of all the verses that could be put together through the Bible that show calling on the name of the Lord. And I want to show you that because there's significance. If we're calling on the Lord together and pursuing the Lord out of a pure heart, the Lord has a testimony on the earth, and he is able to begin establishing his kingdom and defeating Satan's kingdom. So that's the result. So Romans in the New Testament, Romans 10:12b, for the same Lord is Lord of all and rich to all who call upon him. And I was considering Acts 2:21 and Psalm 116:13. Those are both on your sheet there. And it mentions calling together with salvation. And, we may think of our initial salvation, but there's also the need for our continued salvation. And I was appreciating in this way, in the Psalms, it talks about calling on the name of the Lord as a way to draw out of the wells of salvation. So if we want to be those who are full of joy and who are drawing out of the wells of salvation, actually calling is the way to do that. And Daniel, in the next verse there is Daniel 3:17, says, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. In chapter 3, maybe you're familiar with this situation, but Daniel's 3 friends were going to be cast in the fire because they refused to worship the idol that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And if we go back to the matter of not having a defiled heart, rather we would have a pure heart, as it says in 2 Timothy 2:22. I would just say this is this. If you know your God and you set your heart not to be defiled, okay, what it looks like is Daniel chapter 3, verse 17. They take a stand to the extent that they are willingly offering themselves for that testimony on the earth. And it says that our God is able to deliver us, and he says, even if he does not, we will not worship idols. That's what their Daniel's companions said. And so they were thrown into the fire, and then actually the Lord met them there. And that became a testimony to Nebuchadnezzar and all of Babylon. So because they took a stand not to defile themselves, and they refused, even unto death, to be associated with idols and idol worship, God maintained a testimony on the earth. And he chose to meet those 3 people on the earth in that situation and go through that with them. I mentioned that, there's no such thing as an army of one. There's a funny term in the military when you're training with people, and they say you need a battle buddy. You need a battle buddy, right? And if we know that we're in a kingdom versus kingdom warfare, I'd like to just use that term. We need a battle buddy. We need those who would help us pray. We need those who would help us pursue. We need those who would help us flee. And those are ones that have a pure heart, a heart that's not been defiled. So I have one more slide. Colin, if you could go to that one. And let's all read 1 Peter 2:5. Ready? Go.
You yourselves also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house.
Okay, I mentioned that, one stone can be kicked around. But as we get built into a wall, I wanted to give you this picture because this should be, what we have in our Christian life. We should have some companions, maybe some that have, that maybe are older than us, maybe some that are our age, maybe some that are younger than us. But this is the strongest brick in the entire wall here. And that's because it's surrounded with other supporting bricks, right? So as we're built up together, we become a wall against the enemy, but we actually, we become a strengthened testimony as well. So we need to have some companions who maybe have gone on before us or maybe a little more mature, and we need to have some that are where we are in our Christian life. And then we need to be taking care of some companions, taking care of maybe some new ones. And that strengthens God's testimony on the earth. We can these are all bricks. They're all even. One isn't better than the other one. They're all the same. But they're built together and they're built up. So we need companions. We need companions that call on the name of the Lord. We need companions that set their heart. And we need companions that will help us flee and pursue. Okay, we'll stop here for time.